Carrots make your eyesight better. Fat is bad for you, and breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Many of us accept these statements as truth. But are they? Well, let's examine them each. The British used a deceptive campaign in the 1940s, claiming that their pilots had cat-like vision because of their exclusive carrot diet, instead of simply admitting that they had new radar tech. Sugar companies paid off scientists to point nutrition concerns towards fat instead of sugar, and Kellogg cereal invented the phrase, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, in order to sell a product. All of these statements have two things in common. They're all related to food, and they're all clever pieces of what we call propaganda. Well defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. In other words, it's one-sided information given to persuade us. Propaganda has the intention of trying to manipulate us to a certain person or group's ideas. And if we aren't strong, if we don't ground ourselves in the foundation of pursuing humility and truth, we can fall victim to it. In order to prevent that victimization, we need to examine first what propaganda is, how it is used to manipulate us second, and then finally what we can do to protect ourselves in this age of constant advertisements and constant media bombardment. Now, this term that I repeated ad nauseum has three specific attributes that separate it from simple persuasion or information. It serves an agenda, it's presented with bias, and it attempts to manipulate you. For example, examine this North Korean propaganda piece that depicts Americans as barbarians and savages, harming this North Korean woman. All of the attributes of propaganda are at play here. There is an agenda. They're trying to make Americans look like the enemy. There is bias. It's a one-sided argument against the Americans. And if the North Korean government propaganda is actually successful and it keeps the people in fear of Americans, then it has successfully manipulated them. So this demonstrates the nature of propaganda, that it is dishonest. It presents a twisted version of the truth in order to convince you. Now, that doesn't mean that propaganda isn't always untrue. I mean, it's obvious that the Nazis were destroying books like the Bible during World War II. And it's obviously true that when you ride alone in a car, you ride with Hitler. Whatever that means. But it is to say is that propaganda is presented looking at only one side of the issue, and it's trying to manipulate you. And if we aren't careful, we can fall victim to it. But when we think of applying those three criteria, we usually think of more classical pieces, like Rosie the Riveter or Uncle Sam or Nuclear Holocaust. But propaganda and the propagandist looks a little bit different in our modern world. We call it by a different word. Advertisements. Our lives are cluttered and clouded by a constant barrage of ads. Companies specifically make their money off of our support for their actions and their products. Advertisements are a form of propaganda, meant to persuade you without giving you a full list of variables, issues, facts, other companies you could buy from. Every advertisement that you've ever seen is propaganda. From Coca-Cola using a technique known as bandwagoning. Everyone knows about it, so be the cool kid. Have a Coke. To testimonial propaganda. Famous runner Usain Bolt is holding a Puma shoe. He's a good runner, so it must be a good shoe, right? But advertisements are less serious, though, and they don't have the societal impact that governmental or political propaganda has. The danger of political propaganda lies in its ability to uproot the function of a democracy. In a democracy, the people tell their politicians what they want, and politicians enact policies. But with propaganda, the propagandist feeds information down to the people to get his own propagandist policies passed. That is obviously dangerous, but the most dangerous propagandist isn't a politician, or Adolf Hitler, or even some malicious scientist. It's actually you. You and me are the most dangerous propagandists to ourselves. And one of the primary ways is through something known as confirmation bias, where instead of examining all that is true, the facts, we have a tendency to examine that sliver in the middle that confirms the things that we already believe in. To make an example of this, imagine that I was trying to convince you that the most beautiful apples in the world were green apples. So I look up beautiful green apples, and then I compare it with ugly red apples, and I find images of the two. Now, I already have my belief that the most beautiful apples are green apples. So when I look it up and I find something that confirms what I believe, then it bolsters the thing that I already believe. And then I see something that also confirms what I believe, an ugly red apple, and I'm even more bolstered in my opinion, even though there's obviously images that would contradict the two that you are seeing. And we do this all of the time. If you dislike a political candidate, you find and center on things that you do not like. If you think raising taxes is good, you find studies showing that raising taxes is good. If you think that lowering taxes is good, you find studies showing that lowering taxes is good. When we place our minds on something other than an honest pursuit of the truth, we tend to manipulate ourselves. I was like that once. I was my most dangerous propagandist. I was an angry teenager who always needed to be right, so I listened to the Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder shows. I never had my own thoughts. I simply listened and parroted. Now, that's not to say that conservative talk shows are right or are wrong, but simply that on my own chest, I never was open. I simply listened to what they said. I repeated it. I was condescending to others, and I didn't listen. I found my value not in myself, not in some higher ideals, not in the identity that God has called me to, but in pride and in trying to be right. Does that sound familiar in any way? Our modern political climate finds comfort in demonizing other people and applying harmful identities, like when Donald Trump was called racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. We create an enemy, someone to hate, someone who isn't us. Follow whatever our side is doing because at least we're not them. And that's how we get to the intense climate of hostility in our modern political environment. But nobody wants to be in hostility. So what can we do to get out of this? There's a goal we need to prioritize, and that is of critical thinking. Critical thinking is the enemy and the antonym of propaganda, and it's a methodology of asking when you take in information to check it at the door without a preconceived opinion and without bias. To counter those three attributes of propaganda, agenda, bias, and manipulation, we can present three attributes of critical thinking. First, create a new agenda of pursuing the truth. Be honest, be humble, and be willing to admit when you are wrong. Secondly, challenge your own biases and consider why they exist. If you understand yourself and your own biases, then when you take in information, you can check it at the door of your own bias and more critically think about it. And then finally, be cautious of manipulation. Seek whether or not the author is attempting to convey truth to you or trying to manipulate you. And I recognize that all of this isn't always possible. And realistically, you cannot examine every single ad and piece of information. But if anything is to be taken away from the speech, it is simply to be more wary. The principle of attacking propaganda is actually a biblical principle. Romans 12 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." And then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. Propaganda is a pattern of this world, attempting to conform us to its twisted ideals. But by placing the ideals of truth and humility at the forefront of our minds, laying that foundation of critical thinking, then we can be above it. I urge all of us to teach your children and your leaders, your family, your friends, and check yourself. Ground yourself in these ideals, higher ideals than the ones that propaganda try and twist us into. And maybe then we can challenge propaganda and rise out of the hostility that our nation lives in now. So, hopefully today that now we see that carrots don't bestow upon you the vision of an eagle, that you can in fact consume fat, and that there are other meals besides breakfast that are also important. Now we realize the truth. Or was this whole speech just propaganda? Thank you guys so much.